Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. So you wanted to know more about how ability and motivation affect performance, huh? Well, we got really into some fascinating research for this deep dive.
Yeah, the paper we're looking at really gets into it.
It does.
It's a meta-analysis from the Journal of Management by Van Iddekinge and colleagues.
And you know what's really cool?
What's that?
They analyze data from almost 60 studies,
Wow.
over 11,000 people.
That's a lot of data.
It is. So we always hear this idea that you need both high ability and high motivation to do well.
Yeah, you hear that a lot.
But this research actually kind of challenges that assumption.
Interesting.
It is. So there are these two main models for how ability and motivation work together.
Okay.
The first one is the additive model.
Additive.
So imagine you've got building blocks.
Okay.
You got your ability block, right?
Yeah.
You got your motivation block.
Yeah.
And each one just kind of adds to the overall performance structure.
Gotcha. So they're independent of each other.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. What about the second model?
Okay, so the second model is called the multiplicative model.
Multiplicative.
So think about multiplication.
Okay.
If you have one factor that's really low,
Right.
it kind of shrinks the whole thing,
I see.
even if the other factor is super high.
Like a multiplier in a video game or something.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
So if you have tons of ability but zero motivation,
Right.
your performance is still going to be pretty bad according to this model.
So they kind of depend on each other.
Yeah, they're linked.
Okay, so which model does this big meta-analysis actually support?
Drum roll, please. The additive model.
Really?
Yeah. The research found much stronger evidence that basically ability and motivation each have their own separate impact on performance.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's actually really good news.
How so?
Well, it means you've got more control over your performance than you might think.
Because you can work on each one separately.
Exactly. Even if you don't feel like you're, naturally super talented in a certain area,
Right.
if you really put in the effort, if you're motivated, you can still make a difference.
You can make up for it.
Yeah.
Okay, so how much of a difference are we talking here? Can you give me some numbers?
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the researchers, they actually found that adding in a specific factor to measure how ability and motivation might work together,
Okay.
it barely changed how well the model predicted performance.
So they really don't impact each other that much.
Yeah, not really.
Interesting.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So how much does each one contribute?
Okay, so get this: ability accounts for about 60% of performance.
60%.
Motivation about 30%.
Okay.
And their interaction, meaning how they work together, only about 9%.
That's really small.
It is. It's a tiny percentage.
So it seems like even if you're weaker in one area, you can compensate by being strong in the other?
That's the key takeaway. You're not stuck. You're not limited. If your ability is a little bit lower in one area, you can still totally rock it with a good dose of motivation.
So it's not a free pass to just completely ignore ability or motivation.
Oh, yeah, you definitely want to be developing both.
Right.
But it is reassuring to know that you can really leverage your strengths.
Definitely.
You can use your strengths to boost your performance overall.
Okay, cool. So are there any other, interesting details from this research that we should know about?
Actually, yeah. There are some things called boundary conditions.
Boundary conditions. What's that?
They're factors that can change how this whole ability motivation thing plays out.
Oh, okay. I see.
Yeah. And one of the most interesting ones is the difference between state and trait motivation.
State and trait.
Yeah. So trait motivation is your baseline, your overall tendency towards being motivated.
Okay, so it's kind of like a personality thing?
Yeah. Are you generally driven, like a go-getter?
Always striving for achievement.
Exactly.
Okay, I get that. So what's state motivation?
So state motivation is more about the here and now.
Oh, okay.
It's the effort you put into a specific task or, your goals for just this moment.
Gotcha.
Think about when you're really in the zone.
Ah, okay, so it's like that laser focus you get.
Exactly. You can be not a super motivated person in general,
Right.
but you can still have those moments where you're just super focused and driven to accomplish something specific.
That makes sense.
Yeah. And here's the really interesting part. The study found that state motivation was actually a better predictor of performance than trait motivation.
Really? That's surprising.
It is surprising. You'd think those who are just naturally more motivated, those go-getters,
Yeah.
you'd think they'd consistently outperform those who, like, rely on those bursts of motivation.
I would have thought so too. Yeah, you'd think those folks would just like crush it all the time.
Right. But it's kind of like, even if you're not like a marathon runner, you can still train for and like totally nail that one race that you really want to run.
Yeah, exactly. And that actually leads us to another really cool thing they looked at. The setting where the performance is happening actually makes a difference.
Oh, interesting. So like at work versus not at work.
Well, they specifically compared training or lab settings versus, more typical work environments.
Gotcha.
And in those like really controlled settings, training and labs,
Mm-hmm.
ability was way more important in predicting how well someone did.
Huh. That's kind of the opposite of what I would have thought.
Really? What were you thinking?
I don't know. I guess I figured in those environments, everyone's supposed to be focused, right?
Yeah,
Like motivation should be pretty even, so the differences in ability would be what really matters.
that makes sense. But see, here's the thing. In those situations, everyone is usually already pretty motivated to either learn the thing or do well on the test or whatever.
So it's kind of like the motivation part is already taken care of.
Exactly. It becomes more about who has the natural talent, the raw ability to pick up that skill or perform in that specific way.
So the playing field for motivation is kind of leveled, and that lets the differences in ability really stand out.
Exactly. But in a typical work setting, it's a whole different ballgame.
How so?
Well, you're not always going to be in the zone at work, are you?
Uh-huh. Definitely not.
Some days, the motivation just isn't there. And that's where that consistent effort, that day in and day out drive really makes a difference.
Oh, so it's like motivation matters more in the long run when you got to keep showing up even when you don't feel like it.
Exactly. The study actually found that on the job, ability and motivation were almost equally important when it came to predicting performance.
That's good to hear. Means all that, like, showing up and grinding it out actually does matter, even if you don't feel like the most naturally talented person in the room.
Absolutely. Your efforts do add up over time. Now, here's another twist, and this is where it gets really interesting.
Okay, lay it on me.
The way performance is measured also plays a role.
Oh, okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So when you're talking about like objective measures of performance, like sales figures or units produced,
Like hard numbers,
exactly, ability tends to be a stronger predictor in those cases.
which makes sense, I guess, because those numbers are just like what they are. No opinions involved.
Exactly. But when you're dealing with subjective measures like, oh, I don't know, performance reviews, for example,
Everyone's favorite.
suddenly motivation starts to matter a lot more.
So, like, if my boss thinks I'm a hard worker, even if my skills aren't the best, that could actually help my performance rating.
Precisely. It becomes more about how your effort is perceived rather than just the raw output.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about, like, how good you are at your job, but also how much effort you put in and how that's seen by others.
It really is about understanding what success looks like in your specific role.
Yeah, like, are you judged on those hard numbers? Or is it more about how you approach your work and how your boss sees your effort?
Exactly. It's something to keep in mind as you think about your own career and development.
Definitely a lot to unpack there. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole, there's one more thing from the research that we got to mention.
Oh, right. This is a big one, actually. When they really dug into the data, they noticed something interesting about that interaction effect, that little 9% we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that it was actually stronger in the studies that had smaller sample sizes.
Hold on. So in smaller groups of people, ability and motivation work together more.
Yeah, but there's a catch. It could be because of a few extreme cases skewing the results.
Oh, like those super rare folks who are both incredibly talented and super motivated.
Exactly. Or, the opposite. People who are really low in both.
So it might not be a pattern that holds true across the board, just a few outliers, making it seem like there's more of a connection than there really is.
It's a good reminder that even with these huge studies, there are always going to be little nuances to consider.
Yeah, it's those little details that make things interesting.
They really do. So I guess the big takeaway here is that you're not trapped by your current ability or motivation levels.
Exactly. Like putting in the effort, even if you don't think you're naturally gifted in something, can really make a difference.
Absolutely. And remember that in the moment motivation, that focus you bring to those important tasks can really pay off.
It's all about finding that sweet spot, right? where your talents and your drive come together.
That's where the magic happens.
Well said. All right. Well, on that note, I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
Oh, but before we totally wrap up, I want to throw something out there for you to think about.
All right. What you got?
So this whole study, it was focused on general cognitive ability, right?
Hmm.
But what if in certain jobs, it's more about specific skills,
Ooh, yeah, that's a good point. Like maybe there are some jobs where your passion or your like very particular talents actually outweigh that general intelligence stuff.
Totally. Imagine like a graphic designer, for example,
Right.
having a good eye for color, composition, all that, that might be more valuable than just like a high IQ, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not just about being smart. It's about having those specific skills.
And in that kind of job, maybe it's really that passion for design, that in the moment motivation to create something beautiful. That's the biggest driver of how well they do.
So it's like, it's not just about how much effort you put in, but also where you're directing that effort based on the specific skills your job needs.
Exactly. The motivation becomes the fuel that powers those specialized skills.
It helps you use those skills to their fullest potential.
Exactly. You might even outperform someone with more raw ability just because you're so driven to use the skills you do have.
Man, this has been such a mind-blowing deep dive. I'm already thinking about all the ways this applies to my own work.
Me too. So, to everyone listening, as you go about your vet, think about what specific skills really make you stand out in your field.
Yeah, what are those talents that you bring to the table?
And then think about how you can tap into your motivation, both that baseline drive and those bursts of focused energy, to really make the most of those skills.
Find that sweet spot, right? Where talent and drive come together.
That's where the real magic happens.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Keep exploring, everyone, and keep those brains engaged.
Until next time.
See you the next deep dive.